Northanger Abbey, Chapter the 8th. In spite of Udolpho and the dressmaker, however, the party from Pulteney Street reached the upper rooms in very good time. The Thorpes and James Morland were there only 2 minutes before them, and Isabella, having gone through the usual ceremonial of greeting her friend with the most smiling and affectionate haste, of admiring the set of her gown and envying the curl of her hair, they followed their chaperones arm in arm into the ballroom, whispering to each other whenever a thought occurred, and supplying the place of many ideas by a squeeze of the hand or a smile of affection. The dancing began within a few minutes after they were seated, and James, who had been engaged quite as long as his sister, was very importunate with Isabella to stand up. But John was gone into the card-room to speak to a friend, and nothing, she declared, should induce her to join the set before her dear Catherine could join it too. "I assure you," said she, "I would not stand up without your dear sister for all the world, for if I did, we would certainly be separated the whole evening." Catherine accepted this kindness with gratitude, and they continued as they were for 3 minutes longer, when Isabella, who had been talking to James on the other side of her, turned again to his sister and whispered, "My dear creature, I am afraid I must leave you. Your brother is so amazingly impatient to begin. I know you will not mind my going away, and I dare say John will be back in a moment, and then you may easily find me out." Catherine, though a little disappointed, had too much good nature to make any opposition, and the others rising up, Isabella had only time to press her friend's hand and say, "Good-bye, my dear love," before they hurried off. The younger Miss Thorpe began also dancing. Catherine was left to the mercy of Mrs. Thorpe and Mrs. Allen, between whom she now remained. She could not help being vexed at the non-appearance of Mr. Thorpe, for she not only longed to be dancing, but was likewise aware that as the real dignity of her situation could not be known, she was sharing with a scores of other young ladies still sitting down all the discredit of wanting a partner. To be disgraced in the eye of the world, to wear the appearance of infamy while her heart is all purity, her actions all innocence, and the misconduct of another the true source of her debasement, is one of those circumstances which peculiarly belongs to the heroine's life, and her fortitude under it what particularly dignifies her character. Catherine had fortitude too. She suffered, but no murmur passed her lips. From this state of humiliation she was roused at the end of 10 minutes to a pleasanter feeling, by seeing not Mr. Thorpe, but Mr. Tilney, within 3 yards of the place where they sat. He seemed to be moving that way, but he did not see her, and therefore the smile and the blush which his sudden appearance raised in Catherine passed away without sullying her heroic importance. He looked as handsome and as lively as ever, and was talking with interest to a fashionable and pleasing-looking young woman who leant on his arm, and whom Catherine immediately guessed to be his sister, thus unthinkingly throwing away a fair opportunity of considering him lost to her for ever by being married already. But, guided only by what was simple and probable, it had never entered her head that Mr. Tilney could be married. He had not behaved, he had not talked like the married men to whom she had been used. He had never mentioned a wife, and he had acknowledged a sister. From these circumstances sprang the instant conclusion of his sister's now being by his side, and therefore, instead of turning of a death-like paleness and falling in a fit on Mrs. Allen's bosom, Catherine sat erect, in the perfect use of her senses, and with cheeks only a little redder than usual. Mr. Tilney and his companion, who continued, though slowly, to approach, were immediately preceded by a lady, an acquaintance of Mrs. Thorpe, and this lady stopping to speak to her, they, as belonging to her, stopped likewise, and Catherine, catching Mr. Tilney's eye, instantly received from him the smiling tribute of recognition. She returned it with pleasure, and then, advancing still nearer, he spoke both to her and Mrs. Allen, by whom he was civilly acknowledged. "I am very happy to see you again, sir, indeed. I was afraid you had left Bath." He thanked her for her fears, and said that he had quitted it for a week on the very morning after his having had the pleasure of seeing her. "Well, sir, and I dare say you are not sorry to be back again, for it is just the place for young people, and indeed for everybody else too. I tell Mr. Allen, when he talks of being sick of it, that I am sure he should not complain, for it is so very agreeable a place that it is much better to be here than at home at this dull time of year. I tell him he is quite in luck to be sent here for his health. And I hope, madam, that Mr. Allen will be obliged to like the place, from finding it of service to him." "Thank you, sir, I have no doubt that he will. A neighbour of ours, Dr. Skinner, was here for his health last winter, and came away quite stout." "That circumstance must give great encouragement." "Yes, sir, and Dr. Skinner and his wife were here 3 months, so I tell Mr. Allen he must not be in a hurry to get away." Here they were interrupted by a request from Mrs. Thorpe to Mrs. Allen, that she should move a little to accommodate Mrs. Hughes and Miss Tilney with seats, as they had agreed to join their party. This was accordingly done, Mr. Tilney still continuing standing before them, and after a few minutes' consideration he asked Catherine to dance with him. This compliment, delightful as it was, produced severe mortification to the lady, and, in giving her denial, she expressed her sorrow on the occasion so very much as if she really felt it, that had Thorpe, who had joined her just afterwards, been half a minute earlier, he might have thought her sufferings rather too acute. The very easy manner in which he then told her that he had kept her waiting did not by any means reconcile her more to her lot. Nor did the particulars which he entered into while they were standing up, of the horses and dogs of the friend whom he had just left, and of a proposed exchange of terriers between them, interest her so much as to prevent her looking very often towards that part of the room where she had left Mr. Tilney. Of her dear Isabella, to whom she particularly longed to point out that gentleman, she could see nothing. They were in different sets. She was separated from all her party, and away from all her acquaintance. One mortification succeeded another, and from the whole she deduced this useful lesson, that to go previously engaged to a ball does not necessarily increase either the dignity or enjoyment of a young lady. From such a moralizing strain as this, she was suddenly roused by a touch on the shoulder, and turning around, perceived Mrs. Hughes directly behind her, attended by Miss Tilney and a gentleman. "I beg your pardon, Miss Morland," said she, "for this liberty, but I cannot anyhow get to Miss Thorpe, and Mrs. Thorpe said she was sure you would not have the least objection to letting in this young lady by you." Mrs. Hughes could not have applied to any creature in the room more happy to oblige her than Catherine. The young ladies were introduced to each other, Miss Tilney expressing a proper sense of such goodness, Miss Morland, with the real delicacy of a generous mind, making light of the obligation, and Mrs. Hughes, satisfied with having so respectably settled her young charge, returned to her party. Miss Tilney had a good figure, a pretty face, and a very agreeable countenance, and her air, though it had not all the decided pretension, the resolute stillness of Miss Thorpe's, had more real elegance. Her manners showed good sense and good breeding. They were neither shy nor affectedly open, and she seemed capable of being young, attractive, and at a ball, without wanting to fix the attention of every man near her, and without exaggerated feelings of ecstatic delight or inconceivable vexation on every little trifling occurrence. Catherine, interested at once by her appearance and her relationship to Mr. Tilney, was desirous of being acquainted with her, and readily talked, therefore, whenever she could think of anything to say, and had courage and leisure for saying it. but the hindrance thrown in the way of a very speedy intimacy by the frequent want of one or more of these requisites prevented their doing more than going through the first rudiments of an acquaintance, by informing themselves how well the other liked Bath, how much she admired its buildings and surrounding country, whether she drew or played or sang, and whether she was fond of riding on horseback. The 2 dances were scarcely concluded before Catherine found her arm gently seized by her faithful Isabella, who in great spirits exclaimed, "At last I have got you! My dearest creature, I have been looking for you this hour. What could induce you to come into this set, when you knew I was in the other? I have been quite wretched without you." "My dear Isabella, how was it possible for me to get at you? I could not even see where you were." "So I told your brother all the time, but he would not believe me. 'Do go and seek for her, Mr. Morland,' said I, but all in vain. He would not stir an inch. Was not it so, Mr. Morland? But you men are all so immoderately lazy. I have been scolding him to such a degree, my dear Catherine, you would be quite amazed. You know I never stand upon ceremony with such people." "Look at that young lady with the white beads round her head," whispered Catherine, detaching her friend from James. "It is Mr. Tilney's sister." "Oh, heavens, you don't say so! Let me look at her this moment. What a delightful girl! I never saw anything half so beautiful. But where is her all-conquering brother? Is he in the room? Point him out to me this instant, if he is. I die to see him. Mr. Morland, you are not to listen. We are not talking about you." "But what is all this whispering about? What is going on?" "There now, I knew how it would be. You men have such restless curiosity. Talk of the curiosity of women, indeed. 'Tis nothing. But be satisfied, for you are not to know anything at all of this matter." "And is that likely to satisfy me, do you think?" "Well, I declare, I never knew anything like you. What can it signify to you what we are talking of? Perhaps we are talking about you. Therefore I would advise you not to listen, or you may happen to hear something not very agreeable." In this commonplace chatter, which lasted some time, the original subject seemed entirely forgotten, and though Catherine was very well pleased to have it dropped for a while, she could not avoid a little suspicion at the total suspension of all Isabella's impatient desire to see Mr. Tilney. When the orchestra struck up a fresh dance, James would have led his fair partner away, but she resisted. "I tell you, Mr. Morland," she cried, "I would not do such a thing for all the world. How can you be so teasing? Only conceive, my dear Catherine, what your brother wants me to do. He wants me to dance with him again, though I tell him that it is a most improper thing, and entirely against the rules. It would make us the talk of the place, if we were not to change partners." "Upon my honour," said James, "in these public assemblies it is as often done as not." "Nonsense! How can you say so? But when you men have a point to carry, you never stick at anything. My sweet Catherine, do support me. Persuade your brother how impossible it is. Tell him that it would quite shock you to see me do such a thing. Now would it not?" "No, not at all. But if you think it wrong, you had much better change." "There," cried Isabella, "you hear what your sister says, and yet you will not mind her. Well, remember that it is not my fault if we set all the old ladies in Bath in a bustle. Come along, my dearest Catherine, for heaven's sake, and stand by me." And off they went to regain their former place. John Thorpe, in the meanwhile, had walked away, and Catherine, ever willing to give Mr. Tilney an opportunity of repeating the agreeable request which had already flattered her once, made her way to Mrs. Allen and Mrs. Thorpe as fast as she could, in the hope of finding him still with them, a hope which, when it proved to be fruitless, she felt to have been highly unreasonable. "Well, my dear," said Mrs. Thorpe, impatient for praise of her son, "I hope you have had an agreeable partner." "Very agreeable, madam." "I am glad of it. John has charming spirits, has not he?" Did you meet Mr. Tilney, my dear?" said Mrs. Allen. "No. Where is he?" "He was with us just now, and said he was so tired of lounging about that he was resolved to go and dance, so I thought perhaps he would ask you, if he met with you." "Where can he be?" said Catherine, looking round. But she had not looked round long before she saw him leading a young lady to the dance. "Ah, he has got a partner. I wish he had asked you," said Mrs. Allen, and after a short silence she said, "He is a very agreeable young man." "Indeed he is, Mrs. Allen," said Mrs. Thorpe, smiling complacently. "I must say it, though I am his mother, that there is not a more agreeable young man in the world." This inapplicable answer might have been too much for the comprehension of many, but it did not puzzle Mrs. Allen, for, after only a moment's consideration, she said in a whisper to Catherine, "I dare say she thought I was speaking of her son." Catherine was disappointed and vexed. She seemed to have missed by so little the very object she had had in view, and this persuasion did not incline her to a very gracious reply, when John Thorpe came up to her soon afterwards and said, "Well, Miss Morland, I suppose you and I are to stand up and jig it together again." "Oh no, I am much obliged to you. Our 2 dances are over, and besides, I am tired, and do not mean to dance any more." "Do not you? Then let us walk about and quiz people. Come along with me, and I will show you the 4 greatest quizzes in the room, my 2 younger sisters and their partners. I have been laughing at them this half-hour." Again Catherine excused herself, and at last he walked off to quiz his sisters by himself. The rest of the evening she found very dull. Mr. Tilney was drawn away from their party at tea to attend that of his partner. Miss Tilney, though belonging to it, did not sit near her, and James and Isabella were so much engaged in conversing together that the latter had no leisure to bestow more on her friend than one smile, one squeeze, and one "Dearest Catherine." Northanger Abbey, Chapter the 9th. The progress of Catherine's unhappiness from the events of the evening was as follows. It appeared first in a general dissatisfaction with everybody about her, while she remained in the rooms, which speedily brought on considerable weariness and a violent desire to go home. This, on arriving in Pulteney Street, took the direction of extraordinary hunger, and when that was appeased, changed into an earnest longing to be in bed. Such was the extreme point of her distress, for when there she immediately fell into a sound sleep which lasted 9 hours, and from which she awoke perfectly revived, in excellent spirits, with fresh hopes and fresh schemes. The first wish of her heart was to improve her acquaintance with Miss Tilney, and almost her first resolution to seek her for that purpose in the pump-rooms at noon. In the pump-room, one so newly arrived in Bath must be met with, and that building she had already found so agreeable for the discovery of female excellence and the completion of female intimacy, so admirably adapted for secret discourses and unlimited confidence, that she was most reasonably encouraged to expect another friend from within its walls. Her plan for the morning thus settled, she sat down quietly to her book after breakfast, resolving to remain in the same place and the same employment till the clock struck 1. And from habitude, very little incommoded by the remarks and ejaculations of Mrs. Allen, whose vacancy of mind and incapacity for thinking were such that, as she never talked a great deal, so she could never be entirely silent, and therefore while she sat at her work, if she lost a needle, or broke her thread, if she heard a carriage in the street, or saw a speck upon her gown, she must observe it aloud, whether there were any one at leisure to answer her or not. About 12:30, a remarkably loud rap drew her in haste to the window, and scarcely had she time to inform Catherine of there being 2 open carriages at the door, in the first only a servant, her brother driving Miss Thorpe in the second, before John Thorpe came running upstairs, calling out, "Well, Miss Morland, here I am. Have you been waiting long? We could not come before. The old devil of a coachmaker was such an eternity finding a thing fit to be got into, and now it is 10,000 to 1 that they break down before we are out of the street. How do you do, Mrs. Allen? A famous ball last night, was it not? Come, Miss Morland, be quick, for the others are in a confounded hurry to be off. They want to get their tumble over." What do you mean? Said Catherine. Where are you all going to? Going to? Why, you've not forgotten our engagement. Did we not agree together to take a drive this morning? What a head you have. We are going up Claverton Down. Something was said about it, I remember, said Catherine, looking at Mrs. Allen for her opinion. But really, I did not expect you. Not expect me? That's a good one. And what a dust you would have made if I had not come. Catherine's silent appeal to her friend, meanwhile, was entirely thrown away, for Mrs. Allen, not being at all in the habit of conveying any expression herself by a look, was not aware of its ever being intended by anybody else, and Catherine, whose desire of seeing Miss Tilney again could at that moment bear a short delay in favour of a drive, and who thought there could be no impropriety in her going with Mr. Thorpe, as Isabella was going at the same time with James, was therefore obliged to speak plainer. Well, ma'am, what have you to say to it? Can you spare me for an hour or two? Shall I go? Do just as you please, my dear, replied Mrs. Allen, with the most placid indifference. Catherine took the advice and ran off to get ready. In a very few minutes she reappeared, having scarcely allowed the two others time enough to get through a few short sentences in her praise. After Thorpe had procured Mrs. Allen's admiration of his gig, and then receiving her friend's parting good wishes, they both hurried downstairs. My dearest creature, cried Isabella, to whom the duty of friendship immediately called her before she could get into the carriage. You have been at least 3 hours getting ready. I was afraid you were ill. What a delightful ball we had last night. I have 1,000 things to say to you, but make haste and get in, for I long to be off. Catherine followed her orders and turned away, but not too soon to hear her friend exclaim aloud to James, What a sweet girl she is. I quite dote on her. You will not be frightened, Miss Morland, said Thorpe, as he handed her in, if my horse should dance about a little at first, setting off. He will most likely give a plunge or two, and perhaps take the rest for a minute, but he will soon know his master. He is full of spirits, playful as can be, but there is no vice in him. Catherine did not think the portrait a very inviting one, but it was too late to retreat, and she was too young to own herself frightened. So, resigning herself to her fate and trusting to the animal's boasted knowledge of its owner, she sat peaceably down and saw Thorpe sit down beside her. Everything being then arranged, the servant who stood at the horse's head was bid in an important voice to let him go, and off they went in the quietest manner imaginable, without a plunge or a caper or anything like one. Catherine, delighted at so happy an escape, spoke her pleasure aloud with grateful surprise, and her companion immediately made the matter perfectly simple by assuring her that it was entirely owing to the peculiarly judicious manner in which he had then held the reins, and the singular discernment and dexterity with which he had directed his whip. Catherine, though she could not help wondering that, with such perfect command of his horse, he should think it necessary to alarm her with a relation of its tricks, congratulated herself sincerely on being under the care of so excellent a coachman. And perceiving that the animal continued to go on in the same quiet manner, without showing the smallest propensity towards any unpleasant vivacity, and considering its inevitable pace was 10 miles an hour, by no means alarmingly fast, gave herself up to all the enjoyment of air and exercise of the most invigorating kind in a fine mild day of February, with the consciousness of safety. A silence of several minutes succeeded their first short dialogue. It was broken by Thorpe's saying very abruptly, Ode Allen is as rich as a Jew, is he not? Catherine did not understand him, and he repeated his question, adding in explanation, Ode Allen, the man you are with. Oh, Mr. Allen, you mean? Yes, I believe he is very rich. And no children at all? No, not any. A famous thing for his next heirs. He is your godfather, is he not? My godfather? No. But you are always very much with them. Oh, yes, very much. Aye, that is what I meant. He seems a good kind of old fellow enough, and has lived very well in his time, I dare say. He is not gouty for nothing. Does he drink his bottle a day now? His bottle a day? No, why would you think such a thing? He is a very temperate man, and you could not fancy him in liquor last night. Lord help me! You women are always thinking of men's being in liquor. Why, you do not suppose a man is overset by a bottle? I am sure of this, that if everybody was to drink their bottle a day, there would not be half the disorder in the world there are now. It would be a famous good thing for us all. I cannot believe it. Oh, Lord, it would be the saving of thousands. There is not the 100th part of wine consumed in this kingdom that there ought to be. Our foggy climate wants help. And yet I have heard that there is a great deal of wine drank in Oxford. Oxford? There is no drinking at Oxford now, I assure you. Nobody drinks there. You would hardly meet with a man who goes beyond his 4 pints at the utmost. Now, for instance, it was reckoned a remarkable thing at the last party in my rooms that upon an average we cleared about 5 pints a head. It was looked upon as something out of the common way. Mine is famous good stuff, to be sure. You would not often meet with anything like it in Oxford, and that may account for it. But this would just give you a notion of the general rate of drinking there. Yes, it does give a notion, said Catherine warmly, and that is that you all drink a great deal more wine than I thought you did. However, I am sure James does not drink too much. This declaration brought on a loud and overpowering reply, of which no part was very distinct, except the frequent exclamations, amounting almost to oaths, which adorned it, and Catherine was left, when it ended, with rather a strengthened belief of there being a great deal of wine drank in Oxford, and the same happy conviction of her brother's comparative sobriety. Thorpe's ideas then all reverted to the merits of his own equipage, and she was called on to admire the spirit and freedom with which his horse moved along, and the ease which his paces, as well as the excellence of the springs, gave the motion of the carriage. She followed him in all his admiration as well as she could. To go before or beyond him was impossible. His knowledge and her ignorance of the subject, his rapidity of expression and her diffidence of herself, put that out of her power. She could strike out nothing new in commendation, but she readily echoed whatever he chose to assert, and it was finally settled between them without any difficulty that his equipage was altogether the most complete of its kind in England, his carriage the neatest, his horse the best goer, and himself the best coachman. You do not really think, Mr. Thorpe, said Catherine, venturing after some time to consider the matter as entirely decided, and to offer some little variation on the subject, that James's gig will break down. Break down? Oh, Lord! Did you ever see such a little tit-uppy thing in your life? There is not a sound piece of iron about it. The wheels have been fairly worn out these 10 years at least, and as for the body, upon my soul, you might shake it to pieces yourself with a touch. It is the most devilish little rickety business I ever beheld. Thank God we have got a better. I would not be bound to go 2 miles in it for £50,000. Good heavens, cried Catherine, quite frightened. Then pray let us turn back. They will certainly meet with an accident if we go on. Do let us turn back, Mr. Thorpe. Stop and speak to my brother and tell him how unsafe it is. Unsafe? Oh, Lord, what is there in that? They will only get a roll if it does break down, and there is plenty of dirt. It will be excellent falling. Oh, curse it! The carriage is safe enough if a man knows how to drive it. A thing of that sort in good hands will last above 20 years after it is fairly worn out. Lord bless you! I would undertake for £5 to drive it to York and back again without losing a nail. Catherine listened with astonishment. She knew not how to reconcile two such very different accounts of the same thing, for she had not been brought up to understand the propensities of a rattle, nor to know how many idle assertions and impudent falsehoods the excess of vanity will lead. Her own family were plain matter-of-fact people, who seldom aimed at wit of any kind. Her father at the utmost being contented with a pun, and her mother with a proverb. They were not in the habit, therefore, of telling lies to increase their importance, or of asserting at one moment what they would contradict the next. She reflected on the affair for some time in much perplexity, and was more than once on the point of requesting from Mr. Thorpe a clearer insight into his real opinion on the subject. But she checked herself. because it appeared to her that he did not excel in giving those clear insights, in making those things plain which he had before made ambiguous, and joining to this the consideration that he would not really suffer his sister and his friend to be exposed to a danger from which he might easily preserve them, she concluded at last that he must know the carriage to be in fact perfectly safe, and therefore would alarm herself no longer. By him the whole matter seemed entirely forgotten, and all the rest of his conversation, or rather talk, began and ended with himself and his own concerns. He told her of horses which he had bought for a trifle and sold for incredible sums, of racing matches in which his judgment had infallibly foretold the winner, of shooting parties in which he had killed more birds, though without having one good shot, than all his companions together, and described to her some famous day's sport with the foxhounds, in which his foresight and skill in directing the dogs had repaired the mistakes of the most experienced huntsman, and in which the boldness of his riding, though it had never endangered his own life for a moment, had been constantly leading others into difficulties, which, he calmly concluded, had broken the necks of many. Little as Catherine was in the habit of judging for herself, and unfixed as were her general notions of what men ought to be, she could not entirely repress a doubt, while she bore with the effusions of his endless conceit, of his being altogether completely agreeable. It was a bold surmise, for he was Isabella's brother, and she had been assured by James that his manners would recommend him to all her sex. But in spite of this, the extreme weariness of his company which crept over her before they had been out an hour, and which continued unceasingly to increase till they stopped in Pulteney Street again, induced her in some small degree to resist such high authority, and to distrust his powers of giving universal pleasure. When they arrived at Mrs. Allen's door, the astonishment of Isabella was hardly to be expressed on finding that it was too late in the day for them to attend her friend into the house. Past 3 o'clock! It was inconceivable, incredible, impossible, and she would not believe her own watch, nor her brother's, nor the servants'. She would believe no assurance of it founded on reason or reality, till Morland produced his watch and ascertained the fact. To have doubted a moment longer then would have been equally inconceivable, incredible, and impossible, and she could only protest over and over again that no 2 hours and a half had ever gone so swiftly before, as Catherine was called on to confirm. Catherine could not tell a falsehood, even to please Isabella, but the latter was spared the misery of her friend's dissenting voice by not waiting for her to answer. Her own feelings entirely engrossed her. Her wretchedness was most acute on finding herself obliged to go directly home. It was ages since she had had a moment's conversation with her dearest Catherine, and though she had such thousands of things to say to her, it appeared as if they were never to be together again. So with smiles of most exquisite misery, and the laughing eye of utter despondency, she bade her friend adieu, and went on. Catherine found Mrs. Allen just returned from all the busy idleness of the morning, and was immediately greeted with, "Well, my dear, here you are," a truth which she had no greater inclination than power to dispute. "And I hope you have had a pleasant airing." "Yes, ma'am, I thank you. We could not have had a nicer day." So Mrs. Thorpe said. She was vastly pleased at all your going. "You have seen Mrs. Thorpe, then?" "Yes, I went to the pump room as soon as you were gone, and there I met her, and we had a great deal of talk together. She says there was hardly any veal to be got at market this morning. It is so uncommonly scarce." "Did you see anybody else of our acquaintance?" "Yes, we agreed to take a turn in the Crescent, and there we met Mrs. Hughes and Mr. and Miss Tilney walking with her." "Did you indeed, and did they speak to you?" "Yes, we walked along the Crescent together for half an hour. They seemed very agreeable people. Miss Tilney was in a very pretty spotted muslin, and I fancy, by what I can learn, that she always dresses very handsomely. Mrs. Hughes talked to me a great deal about the family." "And what did she tell you of them?" "Oh, a vast deal indeed. She hardly talked of anything else. Did she tell you what part of Gloucestershire they come from? Yes, she did, but I cannot recollect now. But they are a very good kind of people, and very rich. Mrs. Tilney was a Miss Drummond, and she and Mrs. Hughes were schoolfellows, and Miss Drummond had a very large fortune, and when she married, her father gave her £20,000 and 500 to buy wedding clothes. Mrs. Hughes saw all the clothes after they came from the warehouse. And are Mr. and Mrs. Tilney in Bath? Yes, I fancy they are, but I am not quite certain. Upon recollection, however, I have a notion they are both dead. At least the mother is. Yes, I am sure Mrs. Tilney is dead, because Mrs. Hughes told me there was a very beautiful set of pearls that Mr. Drummond gave his daughter on her wedding day, and that Miss Tilney has got now, for they were put by for her when her mother died. And is Mr. Tilney, my partner, the only son? I cannot be quite positive about that, my dear. I have some idea he is. But, however, he is a very fine young man, Mrs. Hughes says, and likely to do very well. Catherine inquired no further. She had heard enough to feel that Mrs. Allen had no real intelligence to give, and that she was most particularly unfortunate herself in having missed such a meeting with both brother and sister. Could she have foreseen such a circumstance, nothing should have persuaded her to go out with the others. And, as it was, she could only lament her ill luck, and think over what she had lost, till it was clear to her that the drive had by no means been very pleasant, and that John Thorpe himself was quite disagreeable.